Hello, thank you for joining me today. My name is Shelly, and I am a student at Louisiana State University Alexandria campus. Today I will be talking about moral injury, which is something I am sure most of you have never heard of. Hopefully by the time I'm done, you will have a clue what I'm talking about. The phenomenon of moral injury is a fairly new concept being studied in psychology. But what is psychology? Well, the further back you look, the farther forward you are likely to see. Winston Churchill. Psychology comes from two Greek words, psyche, meaning the breath of life or the soul, and logia, from the word logos, meaning reason. In English, we all know the ology words are sciences. So, psychology is the science of the soul, at least in theory. Warriors have suffered from what we now refer to as post-traumatic stress disorder since the beginning of recorded history. In the US, veterans account for about 6.4% of the population. However, they account for approximately 20% of annual suicides. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan brought service members home with the troubling trio of invisible wounds: PTSD, TBI, and depression, now collectively referred to as operational stress injuries. We have spent over 4 decades officially studying PTSD, which was first recognized in combat veterans, and yet their symptoms are largely stamped treatment resistant, as the research consistently shows current treatments are significantly less effective for veterans than for their civilian counterparts. The question is, why? What are we missing? Well, here's what we know. PTSD is an injury to the mind. TBI is an injury to the body. And in 2009, Litz and colleagues at the National Center for PTSD published an article in an issue of Clinical Psychology Review discussing the lack of attention to the moral and ethical impacts of war. Moral injury is an injury to the soul. The term moral injury is credited to psychiatrist Jonathan Shay in his 1994 book, Achilles in Vietnam: Combat Trauma and the Undoing of Character. It appears this may be a key piece of the puzzle, a betrayal, either by oneself or others, of a person's deeply held moral beliefs. Witnessing unethical behaviors by others, seeing inhumane acts of cruelty, committing immoral actions themselves. Individuals who are unable to process moral atrocities are at risk of developing a multitude of impairments that are distinctly different from the fear-based threat to life or limb associated with PTSD. Which brings us to our current study. At the most basic level, I wanted to know if there's a place for moral injury research beyond the military and recently healthcare populations. My first hypothesis was that not all traumatic events are created equal. Therefore, moral injury symptoms would be positively associated with offender-caused traumatic events only. There would not be a statistically significant relationship with naturally occurring traumatic events, such as natural disasters. My second hypothesis was that spiritual fitness and religious strength in the absence of traumatic events would mitigate moral injury symptoms, thereby having a negative correlation. Finally, I speculated that the combination of potentially morally injurious and traumatic event exposure would have the opposite effect on the relationship between moral injury symptoms and spiritual fitness and religious strength. For the purposes of this study, moral injury was defined as psychological trauma manifested by feelings of guilt, shame, loss of trust, and spiritual crisis following exposure to an atrocity in violation of one's moral beliefs as measured by the Moral Injury Outcome Scale. Trauma was defined by exposure to traumatic events, which were determined by the Life Events Checklist, and symptoms were established by the PTSD Checklist for DSM-5. Spirituality was measured by the Spiritual Fitness Inventory and defined as the lens in which one views the world, which may or may not include religious practices. Using the Santa Clara Strength of Religious Faith questionnaire, religion was defined as a symptom of spiritual practices organized around the worship of a higher power or a deity. Using Google Forms, I created an online survey with the various measures along with the demographic questionnaire for distribution. Prior to completing the survey, participants were required to acknowledge an informed consent question. Here's Table 1, summarizing the participant demographic characteristics. There were 40 participants that completed the survey. Just over 60% of them identified as female, with the rest identifying as male. 70% were white. Marital status, employment, and educational statuses were varied across the board. 60% of the participants identified as religious and/or spiritual, and 52% reported military affiliation, whether it was active duty, veteran, or National Guard. The mean participant age was approximately 37 years old. Once the survey responses were collected, I converted the responses to numerical values. Table 2 is a summary of this study's descriptive statistics. Using multiple regression analysis, I analyzed the data. The analysis indicated a 35.2% positive association between offender-caused traumatic events and moral injury symptoms, with P being less than 0.001. Natural disaster and other types of traumatic events were not statistically significant, with P equaling 0.91 and 0.13 respectively. Hypothesis 1 was supported. Next, a 34.8% correlation was found between symptoms of moral injury and faith. Both spiritual fitness and religious strength showed a negatively correlated relationship. However, it was interesting that religious strength was not statistically significant, with P equaling 0.63. Spiritual fitness was significant statistically, with a p-value of 0.01. Hypothesis 2 was mixed. Finally, faith, morally injurious, and traumatic events indicated a 36.4% relationship with moral injury symptoms. Again, faith variables were negatively associated and religious strength was not statistically significant. Distressing life events were positively correlated with moral injury symptoms. Traumatic events showed significant correlation with a p-value of 0.01, yet PMIEs were not statistically significant with a p-value of 0.35. Hypothesis 3 was unsupported. An overall research question: could we benefit from moral injury research beyond the military and healthcare populations? Survey says yes. So are these results in line with the research? Given that 87% of the participants of this study reported experiencing morally injurious events, including 89% of those with no military affiliation, this study shows that there is significant research potential for moral injuries in a broader context. Unsurprisingly, this study showed consistently with previous research that moral injury likely has a high comorbidity with PTSD. The results indicate a 67.9% positive correlation between post-traumatic symptoms and moral injury symptoms, with a p-value of less than 0.001, which was the strongest association in the entire study. Given the correlation with moral injury symptoms and spiritual fitness in this study, it supports Harrison Associates' referral to previous research indicating it's not about if life hands you lemons, it's about your ability to make lemonade or not. While the evidence is clear that combat veterans have poor treatment outcomes compared to civilians with PTSD, this study suggests that not all traumatic events are created equal and further research is warranted. Moral foundations theory discriminates between individualistic and binding or collectivistic morals, which is another under-researched area. We are just beginning to understand the importance of the role our moral values play in our mental health and in our trauma. Also coinciding with previous research, this study indicates the relationship between trauma and spiritual beliefs is complicated. In this study, spiritual fitness or development appears to play a much bigger role than religion. This study was designed for distribution among LSUA students only, but due to low responses, it was distributed to non-students who likely have a very different life experiences. For transparency's sake, this was my first time analyzing results for my own research ever, and I could have used at least an extra week. This study was conducted with self-reports, which makes reliability dependent on participant awareness of their own feelings, their mental health, and of their perceptions. Because moral injury research is still so young, with so many unanswered questions, relying on previously established measures was important, but it created a rather lengthy survey which increased the potential for participant fatigue. Being aware of this, I did put the demographic questions at the end. The figures for those reporting potentially morally injurious and traumatic life events are extremely high in my opinion. Further studies should be conducted to see if these percentages are inflated or not. Lorraine Smith McDonald and Associates published a first-of-its-kind study in a 2020 issue of Traumatology. They used a patient-oriented bottoms-up approach. Using classical grounded theory, they asked a group of veterans about their perspectives on their biggest struggles. I don't know why it took 40 years of research for this type of study to happen, but we need more of this kind of out-of-the-box approach. In 2014, psychiatrist Jonathan Shea published an article calling out the APA and the American culture for refusal to acknowledge the mounting evidence that one's character can, in fact, be fundamentally damaged following traumatic or morally injurious events, even in adulthood. The first step in solving a problem is acknowledging that you have one. Over 30,000 veterans have died in the last 20 years, largely because we have ignored their suffering by refusing to admit that evil can and will change the essence of one's being. Since Darwin's publication of The Origin of the Species about 150 years ago, the wedge between science and philosophy has widened to epic proportions. Science is limited to the physical realm, but the essence of what makes us human is beyond the physical. If we follow the empirical evidence as we've all been trained to do, then we must accept that philosophy is instrumental if we are to further scientific advancements in the social sciences. Despite decades of research, PTSD is poorly understood, especially with respect to members of the military. The empirical evidence is clear. PTSD is not the only problem, and it does not address many of their most distressing symptoms, such as guilt and shame. Moral injury, however, does, and spiritual or existential crisis is broadly accepted as a hallmark symptom of moral injury. If nothing else comes from my study or this presentation, my hope is that it shines a little bit of light on the suffering of millions and the souls being lost fighting invisible wars. If you could change anything about your study, what would you change? I would have changed a lot of things. I would have combined questions that were similar to make the survey shorter. There's a lot of overlap between trauma and moral dilemma type experiences. I would have reworked the demographic questions for sure as well. Moral injury research is so new and there's so much to learn that I wanted to be super detailed in case there were any incidental findings or patterns. Since then, I have learned that unfortunately you cannot answer all the questions in a single study. If you or someone you know is contemplating suicide, please reach out to someone. Text HOME to 741-741, or you can call the Veterans Crisis Line at 988 and select option 1, or text them at 838-255.